This is a production of Cornell University.
But I'm going to start this talk out differently than ever before. So who in this room likes landscape paintings? Who doesn't like landscape paintings? I was somebody who didn't love landscape paintings, but I have turned around. And you'll see why I'm talking about this in a minute. But I mean, my work is all about biomass. But the Hudson River School of Art, right, was in the mid-1800s. They were American painters, whatever that meant to be an American in 1800. They were landscape painters, and the school was sort of along the Hudson River, but they also went out west. Some famous names are Thomas Cole, Friedrich Church, Albert Briefstadt, Asher Derland, and George Inness. So what do you think of this one? What's the feeling in this image? Epic. God. Grandeur. Immense. Huge. Hunting. Wild. What's the feeling in this one? Foreboding. Heat. Ominous. Oxidation. I should do this more often. How about this one? What's going on in this one? Yep, agriculture, of course. You're the first to say that the first time. Impending doom. And ag. There's also this little umbrella that's forming and a little top hat down here. How about this one? What's going on in this one? Windy. There's a battle. What are they wearing, those people in battle? Red coats. There's smoke. How's this one feel? Peaceful, bucolic. What?
Tick infested.
Not yet. That comes later. How about this one? How's this one feel? What? Expansive. Prospecting maybe, right? Some civilization. How's this one feel? Settled. And how does that settling feel compared to this one? This is industrialization, right? It's running on coal, the trees are cut off. There's like, it's not just bucolic landscape, it's like the beginning of a city. And then this one, right? This is on the Hudson, right? The industrial action of the fisheries. So the Hudson River School of Art reflect on three themes of America in the 19th century: discovery, exploration, and settlement. And it covers these ranges of experiences of, you come here and this diabolical fear of nature, this heavenly admiration of nature, the coexistence with nature, the utility of nature, and the mastery of nature. And since my talk is about biomass, I'm fundamentally talking about the mastery of nature. But I want us all to remember that all these other experiences of New York I showed you in these images, you could think of them as just fantastical paintings, but they are actually documents of other ways of being on this same landscape, right? And we are making real choices here as environmental scientists about structuring the next generation of what our landscape looks like. Because certainly New York City, where I live, doesn't look like any of the images I have just showed you, right? Horizontal line. It's like the first thing I do for the first hour on the bus when I'm coming here. It's all I'm looking for is the horizontal line. And that doesn't happen in New York. And the reason why it's happening, right, is we're at such a huge population. When I was born in 1973, there were like half as many people as there are now. So we have the same land mass, but we have twice as many people as when I was born. And those paintings I just showed you were when we had, between 1 and 2 billion people. And that's the whole Earth. When you came to the New World, when you came to America back then, there were some real ethical questions about what to do. I mean, it was so beautiful, but then there were all these resources that you could utilize. And so there was a battle between becoming wealthy, whatever that means, and keeping it pristine. Okay, so here's now the formal part of the talk, but I wanted to frame it that way. So how do we manage our landscape for food, feed, fiber, and fuel? And this goes back to my early work with John Duxbury and what I'm continuing to do, work with Peter. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the fuel component. So a couple years ago, with Peter and many other people, we did an analysis of the New York State biomass feedstock production, sustainable feedstock production, and it was based on land availability, land suitability, and biomass yield. And we applied all these different constraints. I'm not going to go over them, I'm sure. Forest will stay as forests. Protected lands, meaning state and federal, are not used, right? Existing wood products were maintained, dead, and 35% of tops were left in the forest for biodiversity, right? We didn't consider equine use. Not all landowners are going to want to grow biomass, right? So only 50% adopt, or roughly. Herbaceous will remain herbaceous. We had all of these factors that we put into this in order to get this biomass feedstock number that could be sustainably produced in New York State. So here's that graph. In some, it's 14.2 teragrams of biomass for bioenergy per year. This is our existing production. It's roughly the same amount, and this is what we think we could sustainably produce in 2020, okay? So this is, if this is what we're producing in the state already, and we're doubling it, it seems like a kind of a large endeavor. It's going to change certain things and practices, but to give you some context of what 14.2 teragrams of biomass is, this is the New York State energy flow chart from NYSERDA's 2015 publication, but it's based on 2013. New York State consumes 3,665 tera BTUs. So funny, I use the T all the time. And then you have these conversions and losses, which is basically only considering the electricity, so that our net consumption is 2,655. All right? This is petroleum is purple, natural gas, coal, other fuels, which has nuclear, hydro, wind. These are sort of proportional shapes, so you can get a sense of what's going in. So this 14.2 teragrams, if we just convert it to a BTU value, right, just as raw biomass, accounts for 7% of this number. Okay? So all of our sustainable biomass, 7% of our current energy consumption. So what we did was, instead of looking at returns on investments, we looked at how we could look at the processes that this biomass would go through to do the most work for society, right? You can make gallons of ethanol, you could make kilowatt hours, right? Those are products in themselves, but what we want to do, since we've got this finite land base with this finite biomass on it, we want to do the most work for society. So this whole analysis is about fundamentally focused on the work. So it's a simple sort of input-output analysis. We use the basic unit of the joule. It is a measure of comparing the quantity of energy, and it misses something of the quality of energy, right? Not all energies are the same when you compare them on a joule basis, right? They might have the same joules, but you can do a lot more with electric joules than you can do with heat joules, right? So just keep that in mind. And then we looked for two types of works, two types of work, heating for homes or buildings, and transport as measured by distance traveled in a vehicle. So what are the steps and the boundaries? Well, we have to plant and grow and harvest the biomass. Then we have to move the wet biomass to a processing plant. Then we have to convert the biomass to a usable form. And then we move that energy product to the consumer. So there are many energy products, right, that we could get out of this cellulosic biomass. It could be ethanol, pellets, grain, electricity. But then we do one more step, which is we convert that energy to work, to think about the end use efficiency. So for growing and harvesting, just to give you an idea, I mean, this list is really long. I'm not going to go through the whole list with you. I'm just showing you 3 attributes of comparing, what happens with maize versus willow. You have to plow maize every year. You plow for the grass one every 10 years. And that affects the energy for the plow and the embodied energy in the plow. So those are some of the attributes that go into looking at the energy at growing and harvesting the biomass across the different types of biomass. Then we have to look at the moisture content of the biomass, because that affects the weight when you're transporting it to the processing center. We look at the BTU content, or the gigajoule content of that biomass, to calculate our raw energy resource. These are the harvest costs that I just sort of alluded to in the last slide. And then distances that the biomass is transported, to a site. So, you can see that maize grain was based on our 2 ethanol plants. So we only have 2 ethanol plants in the state, so there's a farther distance that the corn has to travel. Whereas in the other scenarios, we have 24 smaller biomass plants around the state, so they have a shorter distance to travel, right? But I'm just giving you some of the, and this translates into how much of the dry biomass is spent towards transportation energy, right? There are many attributes, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of what's going on. Then you get to the processing plant. There are 2 existing maize grain ethanol plants, but you could also use that same maize grain for a pellet stove. There's one existing combined heat and power plant that uses wet wood chips in Lionsdale, New York. Cellulosic ethanol, this was in collaboration with our group for the analysis for NYSERDA, which is a next generation cellulosic ethanol production. But then you could also use that same cellulose and make pellets, which could go into a pellet stove, or you could make those pellets go into a combined heat and power plant to generate electricity. So these are some of the scenarios that we saw for this biomass, or processing scenarios. What you need to know about these scenarios or these processes is that they have different numbers of steps, right? And the more steps you do in a process, generally you lose energy. So maize grain is interesting, right? Because at its 15.5% moisture content, you could just pop it in the stove. You don't have to do anything before you get heat. But all you're getting out of that product is heat, right? You're not getting electricity. So it depends on what you want. Some others were one step, so biomass was pelletized for a pellet stove. The wet wood chips were combusted in a real plant to generate electricity, and that plant was 22% efficient in generating electricity. The maize grain is converted to ethanol, or the cellulose biomass was converted to ethanol. Again, one step, and then you have a product that people can use. And then we went one step further, and we did 2 steps where you take that pelleted cellulose and you generated electricity at 30% efficiency, or you put the ethanol in to generate electricity at a slightly higher conversion efficiency. Oops. So once you have your product, whether it's megawatts, it has to go through the grid, and it loses 15% of its energy through the grid, or you use a truck to take it to the distribution center, i.e. gas station, whatever. That was calculated. And then you have to look at the end use efficiency, and this is kind of where the crux of our analysis comes down. I hope you'll see it later, but we put maize in a 75% efficient pellet stove. The cellulose pellets we put in an 80% efficient stove. The ethanol in an 80% efficient home boiler, electricity is 99% efficient in generating heat in a home. For distance, we did ethanol in a 20% efficient internal combustion engine, and we did distance by, electricity in a 75% efficient electric car. Okay? In addition, there are potential co-products, and I say potential because there's always products. Whether or not they're used and considered products is another matter, right? We call it waste generally because we have very poor imaginations. We use waste very frequently. So maize ethanol makes dried distiller's grains. That has a high value for feed, animal feed, but remember this analysis keeps everything on the joule level. We're comparing everything with joules. So even though this might have more value in terms of producing beef or milk or whatever, this is just kept in terms of joules as pellets that could go into a pellet stove, okay? Cellulosic ethanol has a small amount of electricity that's generated as a co-product. And when you generate electricity in a power plant, you generate tons of heat, and you could potentially capture that waste heat. So the Lionsdale biomass plant, which runs on wet wood chips up in Lions Fall, New York, and it's only 22% efficient. It used to sell its waste heat to a neighboring paper plant, and it would dry the paper at the paper plant. Something happened, and they no longer do that, and the paper plant now has a natural gas heater to dry their paper. So even though these two companies are close proximity, again, when energy is cheap, you don't have to cooperate, right? You don't. And that's a very real reality. The maize grain has no co-product, right? You're just combusting it straight for heat. And same thing with the pelletized cellulose for heat. So the summary table that's coming up is based on these 5 characteristics. So I'm going to try to go through this. I mean, just this is important, is what I guess I'm trying to say. So we start out with this biomass, right? It's got a volume, it's got a character, it's got so many BTUs in it. It has a certain moisture content, whatever. And when we want to convert it, we're going to go through some processing losses, okay? It's just, that's what's going to happen. It's going to lose things in the process. We also had to put things in, right? We had to use energy to apply nutrients to the field. We had to transport it by car, right? So those are external inputs, okay? Then we want to do work with that biomass, right? We want to heat our homes and we want to travel distances. That's the end goal. That's the product. But when we do that, we lose energy, right? You lose, it's not an efficient system turning, ethanol into miles driven. It's an inefficient system, so there are these end-use losses. And then there are these co-products that I just listed that could be used, but if we don't use them, then they're wastes, right? So these 5 attributes that I'm talking about, oops, I guess it's coming up. Not next. I'll come back to it. I want to just talk about the scale at which we're doing these analyses, because scale matters. So one scenario is just green wood chips in an existing power plant of 20 megawatts. And it has a simple conversion efficiency of 22%. Maize grain to existing power plants, right? It's 54% efficient. And when I say simple conversion, I mean you're getting all this ethanol out without thinking about any of the inputs that went into it. Okay, so it's 54% of the biomass BTU, but not of the total energy system BTU, right? It just means you put in this much corn, you got this much ethanol out, but you also put lots of other things in. So I'm just giving you these simple conversion efficiencies to show you the range at the very first step without considering any of the other things. So of course, maize grain in a pellet stove, right? you're not talking about the energy that went into making the maize grain. It's 100% efficient because you've got the corn grain already in the form that you want or you need to use in your pellet stove. And this is just sort of a summarizing chart also of inputs and products. So there's the biomass energy content. This is the energy within the biomass that we harvested. And this is the supplemental energy that we had to add to it in order to be able to make the products. Okay. And then we get these primary products, which is, electricity, ethanol, grain, pellets, electricity, ethanol, and electricity. And then these co-products that I was just talking to you about before. Oops. So here's the chart. And I'm going to do it in 3. Doesn't have labels because that comes in the next one. I'm just trying to orient you to this graph. So each one of these bars is a megagram or a unit of biomass. When it's above 0, it's work that is accomplished by society, for society, like distance traveled or homes heated. When it's below 0, it means that it's been lost somewhere in the process, right? It either was lost as an input, it was lost in the processing, it was lost in the end-use efficiency. All right, and to orient you again, these are all about transportation, and these are all primarily about your primary product being heat, okay? So next slide adds more information. So this is the processing loss. While you're converting the maize grain into ethanol, this is the process loss. This is how much product you make, okay? Whenever it's all this green, whether it's striped or not, that's the amount of product you're making. So when you're making ethanol, I don't know, like 50%, right? I said 54% for maize grain. So this is 54% of the biomass is turned into ethanol. However, you had to use this much energy input. So I'm sort of deducting that. Even though you could sell that ethanol, you actually need it to make the next generation of ethanol. This is when you take that ethanol and you put it in your car and you go miles. But it's only in a 20% efficient internal combustion engine. So that means only 5% of the corn grain is going to traveling distance in miles. The rest of it is going off as waste heat into the atmosphere, or maybe heating your car in the winter, right? Now this is the co-product. If we don't use this co-product, it should come down here. In most of these scenarios, we don't actually use the co-product, but this is the potential. In this case, it's dried distiller's grain, and it is actually used for animal feed, okay? So the point here is that these numbers right here, that's the proportion of the biomass that's actually doing work for society. So if you, and then this up here is the co-product that could do work for society if we're clever about it, if we're not already using it, okay? So clearly, using the maize grain or the pelletized cellulose is going to do the most direct work from the primary product. Okay, 64 or 69% of that biomass is going to heat homes. You know, using 5% of it doing transportation if it's ethanol, corn ethanol. All right, if we pelletize this cellulose and we put it in a combined heat and power plant and we generated electricity, 19% of it could go towards driving. Now, if we would just use the waste heat, right? The whole collective would be 60% utility for society. Now we have two products. We've got heat products and transportation products. All right? We like this potentially if we would use, right, because electricity is very versatile. It's a really powerful fuel type, right? If we could just be effective at using the waste heat, then this would be a great percentage. That's like 62% of the biomass is going to products for society. But it requires some coordination so that that waste heat is actually used. So even though this is like the bigger number, it's a bigger number for heat products, right? So the value, the quality of the energy is very different. All right. This moved down, but this is supposed to be highlighting this line. But basically, the same biomass can use 5 to 19% of its photosynthetic energy to drive miles, versus the same biomass can use 12 to 69% of its photosynthetic energy to heat homes, right? If the objective is to do work for society, how do we want to move? What kinds of things do we want to support and move forward? So, to bring this home, in a 25 mile per gallon car, I think the average was 23 recently. I don't know, I meant to check on that. But at an average of $3.23, this is averaged across the last 3 years, okay? Now I recognize when I took my bus, it was $1.57 in New Jersey. So, you can divide this by 2 and get your number. But I don't think $1.57 is forever, but anyways. Gas at $3.23 a gallon, electricity at 18 cents per kilowatt hour, ethanol at $3 a gallon, and E85 at $2.94 a gallon. It would cost $12.78 to use gas to go 100 miles versus $6.07 to go 100 miles in an electric vehicle. Okay? Now, I just reduced this by half, $1.57, so right now they're equal in terms of the cost, right? But you're getting it, right? Look at it at a different perspective. So if we took all the cellulose, all the sustainable cellulose from New York State, and we convert it into ethanol, and we made this many gallons of ethanol at $3 a gallon, it would cost the consumer $4.2 billion to buy those gallons, right? If we pelleted all the cellulose for electric cars, and we converted it to electricity at 18 cents per kilowatt hour, it's $3.7 billion to the consumer, kind of the same price. But you can only drive 35 times 10 to the 9 miles versus 60 times 10 to the 9 miles on the same price, right? Is everybody kind of getting this? So these are my modest conclusions. Our biomass only accounts for 7% of primary energy consumption. We could increase efficiency on all kinds of levels, but in this particular case, I hope it makes it clear, the electric vehicle versus the internal combustion vehicle. And then thinking about diversity of end use, right? We're moving away from just fuels for transportation and thinking more cohesively about the whole system and what we want to deliver to society. Meanwhile, we have to think about seasonal changes and be sensitive to climate changes and how this intensifies the land base and what are the competing uses for this land base, right? We could all go back to the bucolic images of the Hudson River School. That would be a choice. Or we could get really inefficient cars and have that, right? I mean, we have many choices. There's tons of competing land uses. And generally, less conversion means greater social benefit. But remember, it depends immediately. And more saleable product does not mean more societal work, right? That's kind of the point. And this last one, I apologize, I just couldn't help myself, but I'll just move on. So that is that. I would love to entertain questions. Thank you.
For New York? At this point, I really like the pelleted cellulose, right? Because even though it doesn't get the maximum out of the BTUs in the biomass, it gives us two products. And I think that's two very important points. Heat, we live in a freezing cold society. We need the heat. It's a serious necessity, right? It's as important as food, right? But electricity is incredible. It has so much capacity. So while the easy answer is to say, pellet stoves and pellets, for corn or for pelletized cellulose, I live in New York City. I grew up with a wood stove. I have no interest in necessarily going back to wood stove. I think it's a lovely thing, but a lot of people aren't going to accept that. But this electricity is very useful, so we just have to be clever. We've got all kinds of industries that could use that waste heat, right? Or we could just have smaller combined heat and power systems all over the place. I'm looking at apartments in New York City, and I met with NYSERDA a couple of weeks ago to figure out how you identify locations that have combined heat and power systems so that your electricity is co-generating your heat. It's very simple. And in fact, New York City was based on combined heat and power back in the day, but we used coal, which made so much particulate matter that it was actually harmful to everybody. But we have other fuel choices. And what does it mean when you generate your electricity and you use your waste heat? You've just reduced your impact by 50% because you lose so much off that waste heat, right? You don't have to use another energy source to heat that same area. So I am very much of the mindset of combined heat and power, not just for biomass products, but for all of our energy products. It's a very, I don't know why we can't.
With the way that this is set up with growing this biomass and then exporting this energy to energy, I was wondering if it raises questions for me about nutrient cycling. I was wondering if you could comment on that, or maybe that is something we can discuss previously.
Meaning extracting nutrients from the fields or the forests, or these are, okay, so in our analysis that we did at the very beginning of this presentation and for NYSERDA, we do replacement nutrients for those systems. So what that means though at the consumer end, like what happens to the nutrients in the combined heat and power plant ash or in the pellet stove ash, that is not incorporated in this analysis, right? So it's not fully cycling, it's just getting nutrients from another source to maintain the quality of the land. Okay.
I have a question about this. It's a simple question. The fourth one to the right has some byproduct or co-product, and yet it's used for heat, and I'm not sure what that would be.
Okay, so you're talking about?
Yeah, the one that says 26 in the
This one.
Yeah, that one.
Right. So all of these co-products up here could easily be added down here because we're going to use them. Okay? This is a so the green is what actually is a product that we're using in society. This could be a product we're using. So like the cellulosic ethanol, it makes electricity. That most definitely is getting used. That's not the primary product.
Specifically on the heat, there are some, like the one with 17 and 26. What is a law that it could be used? And what is it? What is that co-product?
The co-product is heat. Heat.
Oh, this is waste heat. So
Waste heat. So it's, in these two scenarios, so the wood chip plant, it used to use the waste heat to dry the paper of a neighboring paper plant, and it doesn't. And then this scenario, so this is based off of a combined heat and power pellet plant that is done in Ashapoken, Canada, I don't know. But they don't use the waste heat either. But it's an industrial site, and it could be used. There's all kinds of things.
But Jenny, I think maybe what you're getting at is what's the difference between the primary and the secondary product for that case? Because it says heat up top.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
That's
So,
confusion.
let's see. So the transportation is this green part right here. Transportation is this green part here, and then heat is this green part here. And then these are co-products which are variable according to each system, and they may or may not be used. So in this case, the dry distilled strands are used. In this case, electricity is used. In this case, it would be waste heat that is not used. So,
But just for the one he picked out, just explain what the actual scenario is, right?
okay.
What's the product, what's the primary product and the secondary?
Okay, so in this scenario, okay, great. I see. Okay, in this scenario, we take pelleted cellulose, we turn it into electricity, we move it through the grid, it comes to your home, and you convert it into heat at 99% efficiency in your home. So that's the green part. This is for home heat. At the power plant where you converted it, there's all this waste heat, and that's what this is. All right? And I'm just trying to point out, right, this pelleted cellulose right here for electric heat is the same thing as the pelleted cellulose for an electric vehicle. So this column and this column are the same electricity process and product, but different end uses. Okay? So we're using 19% here in traveling miles and 26 here for getting heat delivered to your home. Okay?
I still think I mean, it seems like you should probably also reduce even the height of the gray bars according to the efficiency of whatever system would be used for the waste products, because I think that's a little bit misleading, because if the efficiency for heat, for some heat is only 26%, I mean, maybe the efficiency for the waste product is only 26%. That doesn't look as attractive, you know?
Understood.
I was just saying.
Okay. So then I'm opening this up for suggestions on improving this graph. Because, actually, I love this graph fiercely, all right? And I did this in a light gray to sort of match this gray, because for all intents and purposes, you know, this should be adding up down here, okay? Because most of the cases it's not even being used.
Yeah.
This is a potential use, and yes, there are going to be efficiency losses, but I don't know what those are.
Yeah,
but this
yeah,
is the range. I get the criticism. I'm totally on board with it.
Yeah.
That's why the green is darker.
Yeah.
So it might be possible to add another bar in the upper gray if there are cases where this is, like you can identify this is feasible. You know, this is actually sort of, this is being done now kind of cost effectively. That might be one way to say it. But there's some evidence of some small real function out of the larger potential.
That's a great comment.
What is the major limitation as to why that secondary release is not being used? Why are you calling it waste product?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to go back to the one scenario that I know, which is...
So why did that power plant why can't they use it for paper?
You know, there was a time when I was really getting along with those guys. It was really fun. And, and they wouldn't divulge. And so, I don't know, but I think that there really must have been some kind of a disagreement. Because the paper plant was using the waste heat to dry their paper pulp. I mean, can you imagine? Of course, when you make paper, it's going to use lots of heat in order to get all that moisture off in order to make paper. What a brilliant thing, because all your waste wood product can go straight into the biomass plant to generate more electricity. I mean, it's an industrial area. It already does.
Let's go back to the...
Was it sensitive to natural gas prices?
That doesn't...
They were going to pay less for natural gas than actually using waste heat?
Yeah, I don't know, but still there should be some negotiation about the price of that waste heat given that context.
So it seems like there needs to be some better understanding of what's going on there, why that, because they're not going to, if it comes down to greed, they're not going to be putting in gas furnaces to dry their paper if they can use this at a cheaper rate.
Okay, but the other scenario I can tell you is from New York City, which used to all be CHP combined heat and power units, but we're running on coal, and we moved it out because of the particulate matter.
So there's a reason why it's not being used.
Right, that's the reason why it's all being made at remote power plants
where who cares about a particular car? Right? This is exactly my point. These are the problems in doing it. Now, meanwhile, so the 14th Street power plant in New York City, right? The one that went out when we had Sandy, and the whole lower half of Manhattan had no electricity, right? Well, that 14th Street power plant, all the way up to 60th Street, all the way down to Chinatown, all the waste heat, the steam, heats all those buildings, okay? It runs on natural gas, so it doesn't have the particulate matter problem. And, you know, it also happens to be very close to the water, which is why it was a problem.
You just made the case of why it is being used. I would like to understand why it's not being used. What other efficiencies?
So that was in the context of historically in New York State. In New York City, we had all kinds of combined heat power plants, but they were coal, and the coal was making too much smoke in the city with the high density population, so it was moved out. Right? That is a reason why the waste heat from those old coal plants are no longer in the city. We could put in other plants and are not.
Okay, how about the smaller town?
Cornell is a combined heat and power plant, right? I mean, there's all kinds of locations. There's a ex-military building in New York City which is combined heat and power because it was built in the 40s, and it's 3,000 units, and they're off the grid. They don't have a clandestine agreement.
Even for the upstate cities, you get electricity. So there would be have to relocate.
Oh, absolutely. But you could also think that it's a good strategy. Instead of having 60 power plants, you've got 200 power plants. They're smaller and they're all over the place. They're getting much better overall efficiency. You're collectively burning less fossil fuels, because probably, for the most part, it's going to be fossil fuel. So if the waste heat typically is like 50% of the biomass, or the energy product that goes in is waste heat, you've just reduced your energy budget by half, because you're no longer reduplicating the heat loss from the electric plant and the heat used to heat your rooms.
So are you saying that theoretically part of this problem is because where the power plants are located?
Yes.
Okay. So this is really a locational problem.
And a societal
Power plants are
problem.
located where they actually could use that cogeneration.
It's also the way economists think about it. They just think about dollars and cents and things. They don't think about efficiency. So, I mean, part of this, this plant relies on a plant that does the wood chips. Why don't we use the word heat to drive the wood chips?
Because I think the volume at which the chips go in and come out. I mean, I think they've run out of chips. I think that plant has lots of logistical things around it.
But I'm guessing it's combined heat power operations. My impression from a few years ago was that you've always had excess heat. And the problem was what do you do with this heat? Not the problem of what do you do with electricity. But that means that society and people like myself and politicians need to think, and business need to think about how do you utilize all of the energy outputs of any of these processes.
To me, what this indicates, right, is that this much fuel, or some fraction of this much fuel, if you want to address climate change, right, this is a really fast, effective way of doing it. I will tell you, for New Year's this year, I was walking in my park, and I picked a rose. Now, I know I'm not supposed to pick flowers in my park, but it was an extraordinary situation. So I afforded myself the freedom of picking the rose in my park on New Year's Day, because until that moment, I had never conceived of being able to pick a rose on a birthday. Now, my birthday is on New Year's. My birthday is on the 10th. And so for the first time in my entire life, I thought, maybe I'll be able to pick a rose on my birthday. Didn't happen. We had a huge freeze spell and killed all the roses. But the point here is that we're living
in a conceptually different moment. Like, it was absolutely inconceivable for me to think I could pick a rose on my birthday. It is no longer an inconceivability because the system is rapidly changing. So if we want to address climate change, I would argue that looking at the waste heat from our electricity system, and I don't mean it necessarily has to be from biomass, right? Clearly, I hope you recognize that all of this biomass, right, we could have bucolic landscapes instead of 7% of our energy. Don't you think you could cut out 7% of your energy to have bucolic landscapes? Right? You know, these are real choices that we can actually make, and we're not making those kinds of choices.
Speaking of choices, how do you put a price or a cost on the ethical issues of burning corn for energy versus using it for feed or food?
Burning is a lot better choice.
So let's burn our food so we can have mass.
I have absolutely no problem with burning corn because if you walk out there today, and if I had to choose, like I have enough calories on my body right now to make it through the next couple of days, but if I had to be out there with no heat, I would really like to burn that corn. So like, I don't have that issue, but I think the issue is that corn is so energy intensive to produce that you could produce all other kinds of things alternatively. So I don't really think there's a food and fuel argument, right? There's like, you could have corn, or you could have corn ethanol to run in a Hummer. You could have an emaciated dog, and you could chase his tail. Seriously, that's what we're talking about.
So, can I just add to your answer? Maybe I'll subtract it, kind of. I mean, sort of a literal sense. So the calculation of this large potential biomass, that's in addition to the food, feed, and fiber we're producing in the state already.
So we'd be growing this in a marginal land, so that where they're not growing feed corn.
So, well, so it's growing on land that's not currently producing the product.
All right.
Now, that doesn't mean you're still making the choice to use all that land to produce biomass instead of additional, food or feed, right? So,
But then the food, within the corn and these will be the lower quality, which is lower quality and actual energy.
well, we need.
The corn kernels are corn kernel, and then the works around.
So I look, yes.
So you make beef out of corn. I mean,
We account for lower productivity.
Okay, yeah, right.
I mean, I looked yesterday at price of corn, the price of wood pellets, and other energy sources, and corn is the cheapest. A bushel is $3.60. A ton of corn, a ton of wood pellets, you can get $200. Used to be. But then I thought, well, Steve's argument about using, you sort of extend that, say you're using nutrients to produce a fuel, and you don't need nutrients in the fuel, but you do in the food or feed. So could we change that? So then I looked to see if any of the plant breeders, anybody in plant breeding is going to be looking at breeding corn or any grain crop where you get a lot of grain but no nutrients in the grain. So that's the advantage of a tree, right, is that the trunk is carbon, it's not nutrients. And this is the disadvantage of the agricultural crops because we bred them to get nutrients. And actually there has been a little bit of breeding done, starting way back on this, but just in one place, somewhere in the U.S., in North Dakota. But I got frustrated. I could find nothing relevant to like low nitrogen corn growing. I could find nothing in the literature.
There is a small
Well, I mean, what you would want is high yield. I mean, really, still in corn. What you don't want you like
So we should stop it here. Give Jenny another hand.
has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.